imagine Donald Trump in prehistory. It's an impossibility. He wouldn't have survived for long. And biologists have discovered this process of what they call survival of the friendliest, right? So for thousands of years, it was actually the friendliest among us who had the most kids. Imagine Donald Trump in prehistory. It's an impossibility. He wouldn't have survived for long. People wouldn't have liked him, wouldn't want to cooperate with him, would have expelled him from the group, and probably would have died alone, right? Or if he was really nasty, would have been executed by the group. So we know this from studies from nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes around the globe, that being friendly, being humble was really a prerequisite if you wanted to survive. Now, it's only recently in this era that we call sort of the civilized era that everything has changed. And nowadays, there seems to be this process that we call survival of the shameless, right? Where so often, if you are shameless, that can actually be an advantage, which is, I think, highly unnatural for us as a species. Because, one of the most fascinating things that I discovered during my research is that human beings are actually the only species in the animal kingdom that blush, which is a fascinating fact, that we blush. And for thousands of years, it was an evolutionary advantage for us because it helped us to cooperate. And I think we need to go back to that vision of human nature. In the book, I start with a very old theory within Western culture, which is the idea of Veneer theory, right? And the idea goes like this. Supposedly, civilization is only a thin veneer. And as soon as something happens, say a war or a natural disaster or you shipwreck on an island, then supposedly people reveal their true selves. And, they show that they're really animals and they're selfish. If you look, for example, at the news coverage of natural disasters, it's pretty much always like this. It's always Veneer theory. The news is full of stories about looting and violence and plunder, all kinds of horrible stories. But actually, what sociologists have known, basically since the 1960s, is that what you get every single time after a natural disaster is an explosion of cooperation. People are really working together. A great example is what happened after Katrina in the US. Rebecca Solnit has written a fantastic book about this, A Paradise Built in Hell. But there are many other examples around the globe. So it's really the opposite of Veneer theory. But still, this theory is so deeply entrenched in our culture, the idea that deep down we're all selfish. It goes back all the way to the ancient Greeks. You find it with the Christian church fathers, the idea that we're all born as sinners. Even the Enlightenment philosophers, David Hume, Adam Smith. I think you could argue that the US itself was sort of founded on the idea that people are selfish. If you read some of the texts of the founding fathers, John Adams, for example, he wrote an essay that said all men would be tyrants if they could. Or James Madison, who said, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Let's be real. Let's assume that most people are selfish. So often when people say, oh, you got to be a realist, they say, well, don't be too idealistic, right? Otherwise, you're naive. And so I think that the larger project here is sort of to try and redefine what it means to be a realist. Is that actually the realistic scientific position these days is to sort of conclude that actually human beings have evolved to cooperate. And there's actually this process in our evolutionary history that biologists call survival of the friendliest, which is very much the opposite of what I had always thought. It's a quite revolutionary idea. So at first it may sound like, oh, this guy has written some nice happy clappy book about how human beings are friendly. No, actually the implications are really revolutionary because, if we cannot trust each other, then we need them, right, to keep us in check. Then we need the CEOs and the managers and the bankers and the monarchs and the generals and you name it. Then we need those in power. Then we need hierarchy. If actually most people are pretty decent and can be trusted, then we can move to a radically different society.